This short video is going to go over the play Trifles, which is a one-act play by Susan Glaspell. So make sure that you have a paper and pencil ready so that you can take some notes. Feel free to pause this video whenever you need to so that you can get through this short lecture. So as we talk about Trifles, we're going to be talking about the history of the play, including the Provincetown Players, who are the first group of actors who put the play on. Glaspell was part of them. We'll talk a little bit about the historical context, and then we'll hit some of the major themes. So what we have here is a portrait from the very first production of Trifles by the Provincetown Players, and it includes Susan Glaspell playing Mrs. Hale. So the play was produced for the first time in August of 1916 by a group of, as kind of a consortium of thespians and artists and intellectuals known as the Provincetown Players in Provincetown, Massachusetts. For the first play, Miss Glaspell played Mrs. Hale, and the play itself is a dramatization of a story from about 16 years before. So Glaspell was a reporter in the early 1900s, and in December of 1900, or shortly thereafter, she reported on the murder of John Hassock. Hassock was murdered in Iowa. He was murdered by 4 axe blows to the head while he was sleeping in his bed. And his wife, Margaret, at the time was arrested and charged. She was sleeping next to him in the bed and claimed that she had not heard anything at all, much like Mrs. White does in our play. At the time, an all-male guilty found Mrs. Hassock guilty of the murder, and she went to prison for life. After about a year, however, that conviction was overturned, and a second trial resulted in a hung jury. So Glaspell had gone as a journalist to take a look at the woman's kitchen. She toured the house once Mrs. Hassock was in prison already, and she said that she'd always wanted to write a short story about the case. She did, called a jury of her peers, and then later on, her husband, who was one of the Provincetown Players, as well, kind of announced that she was going to write a play about it, and she was kind of forced into writing a play about this particular murder. Now, the Provincetown Players are probably one of the most important developments in American theater. It was a collective in the 1915 is when it started, led by George Cram Cook, otherwise known as Jig, and his wife, Susan Glaspell. Should tell you something that even in the 1915 as early as that, these two were using their own original birth names instead of Mr. and Mrs. So in 1915 to 1916, the Provincetown Players were based in Provincetown, Massachusetts. 1916 through 6 seasons, they were in New York City and Greenwich Village. And this was one of the really first modern American theater collectives. It's been called the most important innovative moment in American theater because out of the Provincetown Players, we get some of the most important dramatists and playwrights in American history, including people like Eugene O'Neill, whose plays are routinely done on Broadway still today. Edna St. Vincent Millay, who was a dramatist in addition to her poetry, Juna Barnes, Wallace Stevens, and Alexander Walcott. So just to kind of put you in the historical context of this play, the thing that you want to remember is that when the play was put on, when it was written, and the specific incident it was written by, we're talking about a period before women are granted full citizenship and the right to vote. So suffrage is not really granted until 1919. Before this time, juries were all male. The characters of the play would know this. The sheriff is a man, the investigator is a man, the lawyers will be men, and the people who decide Mrs. Wright's fate will be men. It's why Glaspell called the short story A Jury of Her Peers, because the original person that this particular play was based on didn't get tried by a jury of their peers. So the other thing to think about, though, is that as much as this has kind of a feminist tinge to it, this is not just a simple call for women's rights. We see throughout the play that this is a really complicated and complex situation. Women within the play judge Mrs. Wright, and they place judgment upon her and make choices based upon their judgment. And the judgment is read on whether or not she is a good wife, whether she's doing her job as a wife. But eventually throughout the play, the moral dilemma of murder takes on a gendered hint, right? So what is just when the world is run by men? And what is just when The law is made for and by men. What is just for women when they don't have voices? Who gets to determine justice? These are all questions that this play really asks. It's very interested in themes of justice, maybe first and foremost, but also perception and identity. It's important to realize that throughout the play, we never see Mrs. Wright. Ever. We don't see her. She's not on stage. She does not have a voice. The only thing we know about her is based on what other people tell us. It's based on how other people judge her. Another really important theme in this play is the power of silence. The women in the play don't enact their power by arguing their position the way that many suffragettes did. In fact, what they do here is they silently make choices, they keep quiet, and they enact power through silence. The play also demonstrates the kind of entrapment of women in this society. There is no real winning here. If they are a good wife and they do a good job with the house and home, they're ridiculed. And if they don't, they're ridiculed. And then finally, ideas of guilt. Whose guilt, what kind of guilt, and who should feel guilty in this situation. There are a few symbols to kind of pay attention to as you read through the play. One of the symbols that you might not necessarily see right away is the quilt. So the quilt is, they say she's doing a log cabin pattern. And that's what you see on the screen here today. So a log cabin pattern features a single square kind of penned in by other squares. And in that you can kind of symbolically see the women in this play, especially Mrs. Wright, who is penned in. We could also see the quilt as symbolic of a log cabin being like a home that she's trying to build by stitching herself a quilt. In addition to that, the quilt becomes a symbol of her guilt or innocence. The uneven stitching is a way that the women are able to judge Mrs. Wright. And when they gently start to unravel the stitching because it bothers them, it's the first step of destroying evidence. And like a quilt is often pieced together by numerous people in a quilting bee, the case and the guilt or innocence of Mrs. Wright gets pieced together. Other important symbols are the canary. This one's pretty obvious because they talk about the canary singing beautifully, and they also talk about Mrs. Wright as a girl having a beautiful singing voice. Her husband allegedly kills the canary, and the implication is he's also killed her joy, right? The music that she made as well. The rocking chair on the stage is another thing that we could look at as an important symbol. It stands empty. Nobody sits in it. If anything, it kind of stands in for the empty presence of the missing woman. Mrs. Wright's not there. All we get is her empty chair. The jars of preserves is another really interesting symbol that we can look at in this particular play. The jars explode when the house turns cold in the same way that perhaps, allegedly, Mrs. Wright explodes as well. And finally, the home itself becomes a symbol. A home should be a place of warmth and welcome, but the home is cold when they walk in. It's empty, things are in disarray. And the home, instead of being a place of welcome, became Mrs. Wright's prison based on the hints and the signals and the clues that we can put together. So Trifles is a fairly short one-act play. It's a pretty quick read. It's really interesting to kind of look at how these characters determine guilt, innocence, and worth. And as you read through, think about those modernist and also realist themes. Like, how are we representing reality? How are we seeing the interiority of characters based on the evidence on the page? And how do we get to an idea of the truth? So I hope you enjoy Trifles. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.